looking at the forecasting workflow. We'll be performing a few actions here, mainly generating a consensus forecast through collaboration with one of our sales reps, John. We'll be pushing this into the S&OP planner. Lorena will then review our forecast, view our supply, prepare for her S&OP meetings, and then send some of the tactical decisions that's being made in this S&OP process down into the operational planning. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. And I'm going to start off with Susie. So Susie is our central forecaster. She's completed most of her tasks already. She's initialized her forecast. She's done her alignment. But one thing she needs to do before getting some feedback and releasing the central forecast is she wants to introduce a phase-in. So let's go ahead and do that real quick here. I'm going to phase in SKU 110. I'll make a right-click here, and I'll phase it in based on similarity. Now, we want to phase in this product based on SKU 15. So here we've searched for SKU 15. I'll go ahead and hit the blue plus and the OK. And what we'll be doing here is we're going to phase in 110 with a run of our expert system in the same way that the forecast is being generated for SKU 15. So what I'm going to activate here is the processed sales history. Now again, we are phasing this product in, so there's actually no processed sales history. But because we're phasing it in based on the similarity of SKU 15, we are representing the processed sales history of SKU 15 here without actually having to replicate it. So what I'll do real quick is I'll go into my pyramid and I'll search for SKU 15, and you'll notice that your screen hardly changed. We're indeed seeing the same processed sales history and almost the exactly same calculated forecast. Now, of course, if we go back to SKU 110, we see that there is a phase-in between April and October of 2020, but that's what we want. So this product life cycle is looking pretty good. I'll go ahead and check this off in my action list. Now again, this action list is being populated from the workflow manager, what I was showing you originally at the very beginning. So again, definitely tune in to our summer UGO where we explain the design and management of this workflow. You'll see me using these action list actions, clicking on them throughout the demo. I'll check this one off, and I can go ahead and release my central forecast. So now I want to move over to John. Now John is a sales rep, and he's in charge of Atlanta. Lucky man. So as John refreshes here, he gets updated with the forecast that was initialized by Susie. I'll go ahead and do that. Oops, there we go. Yes, yes, yes. I'll go ahead and initialize again with Susie. And then I know that I'm going to be getting some feedback from one of my clients, specifically client 1. So if we look at the planning view on the bottom, we see it's a typical planning view with gray, white, some blue cells. We see we have a calculated total base forecast line here in orange, and everything's looking okay. The client did call me and told me that they are sending over a new forecast. So what I want to do is I want to bring that forecast here into OMP. Now real quick, I'd like to open up the Excel that they sent me. So if we look at this Excel, we're seeing we have 2 records. They're both monthly records, the first one being in May, the second being in June. But they've only given us some volume. They haven't told us which products they need. They just said we need 1,500 in May and 1,500 in June. With OMP Plus, This is not an issue at all. Let's close out this Excel and see what happens when we load it in. So the first thing we notice is in the planning view at the bottom, we have 2 green cells. These cells both have 1,500 in them to reflect the update that we've received from our client. Perfect. The next thing we want to look at is when we expand the client out, we're going to be getting the forecast they gave us spread out now. This is being distributed across all of the products. That means that importing these forecasts in OMP, we can do this at any level and it's not a problem. We can define either breakdown rules for the way we want this forecast to be distributed across the SKUs, or we could even base it off of sales history. Okay, so I have my demand updates here. I will mark this as completed, and I'm going to send it back to Susie. I will load in Susie's profile and refresh. And now I'm going to validate. I want to generate my consensus forecast, so I need to see who has finished their validation process. This dashboard is a great tool for looking at that. If I drill down, I see that a few of my regions have not completed. But if we look at Atlanta, John has done his job. Now earlier we saw a total base forecast line here in orange, and now this line is also represented in brown. This is reflecting the updates that we were given from John. I like this. It's looking good. I would say my forecast has been generated and I'm ready to publish this to S&OP. So the first thing we note here is that we've got an email. So an email has been created with an attachment. And I'm going to open up this attachment. And what do we see here? Well, we see our forecast broken down by product family and by location. I'm going to want to send this forecast off to my other S&OP meeting participants, possibly to have them review this before they attend the meetings. Now, because I'm not actually Susie, I can't actually send this email, so we'll just keep moving forward. So now that I've published my consensus forecast to S&OP, let's move over to Lorena, our S&OP planner. I'll perform a refresh here. And my first action as Lorena is to review or follow up on the newly introduced products. Now remember, we introduced SKU 110 based on SKU 15. And if we expand our pyramid to look at these newly introduced products, we can head over to Family 110, which contains SKU 110, and we do see that we are phasing in with the base forecast mirroring the phased-in base forecast that we created with Susie. So that's looking good to me. I also want to highlight SKU 01. We'll be looking at this product throughout the rest of the demo, and we see that it's begun to enter the market. I also want to highlight real quick here this first cell we see. Now if you note this first cell we see in our planning view for here, month 4, April 2020, the month we are currently in, it's already grayed out, dark gray boxes. This is our frozen horizon. This means that what we're seeing here in the S&OP process is already live and it's already being taken into account. Okay, so I've looked at my newly introduced products, and I'm pretty good with this consensus forecast. So let's do a little bit of performance analysis. So when I click on the performance analysis action, we're brought to a very beautiful dashboard. Now this dashboard is going to tell me a lot of information about my different product families. We're going to be able to see the deviation in our demand between the planned and actuals. We also get to see the MAPE percentage. We see the difference in our production planned and actuals, as well as their attainment percentage, and along with our inventory, the planned and actuals, and the difference, the delta percentage. Right now we're performing the pre-S&OP meeting process of trying to review and understand what's happening end-to-end in our supply chain so that we can head into that S&OP meeting confident, ready to make decisions. I want to highlight here, we see the MAPE percent is not very good for family 17. So if I wanted to look at family 17 in a little bit more detail, I can simply click on the bar here and the deviation, and the charts on the bottom will adjust to reflect family 17. And we can indeed see there are large deviations for November and December of 2019 where the plans are not meeting the actuals and the actuals are greatly exceeding the plans. This is not just in demand, this is not just in production, it's also in inventory. We see it across all three levels. Okay, so I've looked at my performance here. We can go ahead and check this off. And now what I want to look at is I want to set a base. So as I head into my meeting, I need to look at a few more things, a few more important points. I notice here I have some demand changes, capacity changes, and inventory on hand changes. So what I'll do is I'll navigate in the left here to my to-do list, and as I open my lost sales, I see that indeed I am experiencing lost sales for a few of my top 10 demand changes. The demand has increased, but production has not changed, and because of that, we are experiencing lost sales. So how can we correct this? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to let our autopilot take over. I'll run the autopilot here, and the autopilot is going to be a solver taking into account your business rules. It's going to look at all of your rules, the changes in demand, and it's going to give you the best answer to solve these lost sales. Before I talk about the chart or the flow chart we're seeing here, I'd like to refresh my to-do list. And we do indeed see that 6 of the 7 have been solved, which is great. There's one remaining though, Washington. And like I mentioned earlier, we'd be talking about SKU 01, the new product that's just started in the market. In the flow chart here, I'll go ahead and highlight at the very end, again, SL Washington, and we see a negative 213, mirroring the to-do list lost sales. By selecting this, a planning view opens up, and again in this planning view, we notice that month 4 is dark gray, because the dark gray is our frozen horizon. Okay, so Washington's not doing so good. Let's set this as a base. Let's set this as a base and then perform a little bit of scenarios analysis. Let's do some what ifs. So I'm going to set this as my base. Thank you. I'll check this off, and we're going to move into what if. So I've got a couple different scenarios in mind. One thing I'd like to highlight in the flow chart is that if we look at this node, DC3, all of it is being sourced from Plant 3. All of the production is currently occurring at Plant 3, flowing into the DC. Maybe we can adjust this. I'll click on the DC, and when I do, I see a percentage. Plant 3 has 100% of the production. Let's try and change this a little bit. We'll do 85% from Plant 3 and 15% from Plant 4. I'll rerun my autopilot, and the autopilot's going to take into account the changes that I just made. It's going to understand I only want 85% from Plant 3, 15% from Plant 4, and let's see if it can solve the lost sales issue. So the first thing I want to highlight is I want to highlight that indeed there is no longer a number, negative number, more importantly, belief, SL Washington. And if I refresh my to-do list, indeed we've got a feasible solution. We can also navigate to the bottom right in our overview where we see our KPIs. We see increased revenue, but at a cost, production and transportation specifically. Since this is feasible, I will save this as a possible scenario, and I'll call it sourcing, because we've adjusted our sourcing. Okay, that's one scenario, but what scenario analysis if you're only doing one? I'm going to revert to the base to allow us to perform another what-if scenario. If I refresh my to-do list, I see that indeed we have our lost sales, and this is also reflected in our flow chart. So the next thing I'd like to think about is what happens if I built up some inventory. I'm going to click on the node for SKU01 at Plant 3, and I see at the bottom of my planning view I have the possibility to adjust my target inventory. Right now our target inventory level is 500, but this is not enough to meet our demand. I'm going to increase the target inventory for next month so we can start building up this inventory. I'll do 100 next month, 200 the month after, 300, and then we'll steady off at 400 above the original target of 500. That means we can increase by 100 every month up till August. So now I'll rerun the autopilot, and what this will do is, again, take into the account the adjustments that I've made to my target inventory and see if it can create a feasible solution to solve my lost sales. I'd like to highlight first the flow chart. Indeed, SL Washington has been resolved, which can also be reflected in the to-do list. Again, we notice our KPIs, increased revenue because we are no longer experiencing lost sales, and we have an increase in our service level. But at what cost? Production, transportation, and also inventory. Now this is feasible as well, so let's go ahead and save this. We can also see, if we move over here to the Simulations tab, an overview of the different scenarios that we've been creating, both inventory and sourcing. We have full visibility of the cost impact that both of these options have on my supply chain. So this is some good what-if scenarios. I'll check that off, and today we won't be communicating with our supplier. If you're interested in seeing that, again, definitely check out our UGO from this past summer. So now the next option would be preparing any S&OP reports, possibly outside of OMP. And then we want to move into selecting a scenario. Again, we're still preparing, or now we've entered into our S&OP meeting. We're in our meeting. We've talked about the highlights. We've reviewed the balanced scenarios, and we're ready to make a selection. So here we see the two scenarios that indeed we created earlier, both inventory and sourcing. We see that their revenue is about the same because we're both meeting those lost sales. The production cost is a little higher for sourcing. This is because sourcing is producing at plant 4, where there was originally no production. So because of that, the production cost is a little bit higher. Whereas inventory has increased inventory costs, transportation cost is about the same. But what's key to me here, because we are looking at SKU01, that new product that just is entering the market, I like the service level increase. I want to make sure that we are introducing this product to the market with a strong service level, and that tells me this is the scenario I want to accept. So let's do that. Give it a thumbs up. Check off my scenario selection. Communicate my decisions. And I'm going to send this to operational planning with the adjustments that we have made. Again, we want to push these tactical decisions to the operational level. Okay, while this finishes up, I'll go ahead and move on over to Jason. And Jason is our operational planner. Something I'd like to talk about real quick about Jason. Let's look at the planning view that's available here at the top of Jason's profile. Now, Jason is a planner for Plant 3, and Plant 3 alone. Jason plans in a 2-month horizon in weekly buckets. I'll do a quick refresh here to load in the scenarios. And I'll continue speaking about Jason's profile. So if we look at Jason, the first month, April, these 5 weeks are actually what's going to be considered the frozen horizon in our S&OP profile, while the last 4 weeks are going to be the initialized from our S&OP profile. So it is definitely a two-way communication here between S&OP, operational planning, allowing both parties to give each other feedback. So here we've selected SKU01 in our pyramid, and let's talk about the lines for SKU01. So the first line we have here is S&OP independent requirements. Now these are the sourced, this is the net forecast that is sourced from S&OP based on the decisions that Lorena made. Next we see our total plan available line. This is your typical plan available line. Here we see that SKU01 can be produced at machine 1 and machine 2, both within plant 3. And finally we see the target inventory line. And this is the inventory against which we will plan. As I navigate to the right in our planning view, we notice that we have 600 target inventory for May versus only 500 for April. Why is this? Well, this is because we have increased our inventory based on the scenario we accepted at the end of the S&OP process. So we have increased May's target inventory from 500 to 600, and here it is reflected in our operational planning. Again, this inventory is spread out over the weeks and the month with an additional 20 units each week. All right. This is looking good to me. I've reviewed and applied my S&OP decisions, and I need to update a few operational parameters. So as I select the action of updating operational parameters, I will zoom in here. we see that I have my machines at the top, all for plant 3. And when I select a machine, I'm listed with the capacity, as well as the parameters of the machine on the right-hand side. This gives me the opportunity to view my machines and make adjustments to the capacity here in operational planning. Now, we got some bad news over the weekend, and the news is that for the last 4 weeks in May, machine 2 will have to be shut down for some unexpected maintenance. I will go ahead and select the last 4 weeks. Change the capacity to 0 and make a save. Because we've adjusted our capacity, we need to initialize the base capacity again. As I navigate back to my planning view, I will change my focus now on the bottom from components to machine, and we start to see some red boxes because unfortunately the base capacity here is no more. All right, we don't have any base capacity. Let's let our autopilot try and solve the problem. He's going to take into account the changes of capacity that we're experiencing, and he's going to try and create a feasible solution, also respecting all of your business rules. As I zoom out of the top planning view, we see that indeed the conflicts for SKU01 have disappeared. This is because SKU1 can be produced also on machine 1. So we've used some of the capacity from machine 1, transitioned the production over there, and everything's looking good. I wish the same could be said about SKU07. The unfortunate fact with SKU07 is that it can only be produced on machine 2. We see the conflict in our planning view, and because we only have the capabilities of planning at plant 3, I need to escalate. The decisions need to come from S&OP now. So let's make a save. And we'll navigate back to our S&OP planner. As I begin to analyze my parameter attainment, some feedback that I've gotten, I see that my OPR plan is not exactly what I had sent. For May, Family 7 is producing much less, along with Family 8. And this is possibly due to the downtime that's occurred on machine 2. We see this also reflected in the chart on the right, our inventory comparison. We see it reflected in our lost sales as well. And finally, we see this in our OPR load comparison, where indeed machine 1 is now at a higher load, 27% higher, because it's taking over the production of SKU01. So now that I've had the chance to review, we see that the tactical decisions that have been made have been communicated to OPR, and we've been able to monitor the current OPR plan against those tactical decisions. That's the end of the demo, and I'd like to go back to our workflow management to recap and summarize what we've seen today. We saw the introduction of a product life cycle, a phase-in of based on similarity for SKU 110. We saw the collaboration between Susie and John to create a consensus forecast before communicating that consensus forecast to Lorena, our S&OP planner. Lorena reviewed the forecast, reviewed the supply, had the opportunity to look at some beautiful dashboards to see our performance, make some analysis before her S&OP meeting, prepare a few scenarios, and then during her S&OP meeting, they were able to make a decision on the scenario that they wanted to select. After selecting the scenario, they communicated these tactical decisions to the OPR planner, where Jason was able to take those decisions, make some adjustments on his machine capacities for downtime, run the autopilot, and then from the autopilot, escalate any potential conflicts which he was not able to solve. I thank you guys for tuning in today, and I'll go ahead and turn the control back over to Philip.
The last 6 minutes to cover some Q&A. I will pick up some of the questions that were asked. So first question is on the demo itself, when Boone showed some of the scenarios. One of them was a, let me take it back here. Yeah. So one of them was an inventory build-up scenario. And to your point, there was a question on why did Boone need to do manual safety stock adjustment. So the number itself in the safety stock is typically given by either our inventory optimization or a more basic formula or externally integrated. And then you have two options in the scenario. Either you let the solver decide with then possibly a higher cost to do the inventory build over the defined safety stock itself, or you want to control it more interactively and allow the solver to use a delta of additional safety stock to then build up in advance based on, of course, the costing as well. So that's a decision, how far you want to go in the scenario, but the autopilot that was shown is not a heuristic, it's a cost-profit optimization which uses the network constraints that were defined there by the user. You also have what we call the full margin-based cost-profit optimization, which is one step further. The main difference is that those decisions then that you saw in the autopilot can be more automated to take them already into account with different cost tiers. For example, when you want to extend capacity, you can either say, I decide, because I want to have control over adding an extra shift, or I let the solver automatically decide to do that, to make that decision based on the extra cost that it takes to have the additional shift active. Okay. Good. We had another question on some of the reporting. So you saw, for example, in the comparison between the scenarios, the question is, well, some of those KPIs that you saw showed differences when there, for example, was not a difference in the revenue, but of course behind the consolidated KPI there was more movement than just on that SKU one and the one in Washington, because with additional capacity or more inventory build, you attain possibly more of the demand covered, plus also more of the safety stock covered on other levels of products, which could, in the definition of your service level, influence the factor as well. Okay, we have a question on DRP, and it's a good point. Where does DRP fit in? And that is linked to DRP or concurrent planning, because it typically drops in, again, integrated in both levels. So both the more rough cut DRP, where you have your network not only with the manufacturing nodes, but also with the distribution nodes up to a certain level of detail that is then further worked out, further detailed in the more operational planning. But it's important to have those nodes then taken into account simultaneously with some level of manufacturing constraints to also, just as we do a reality-based SNOP, to also run a reality-based DRP. And one last question is on the access, because Boone showed one level of interaction with customers, and you can either, that the sales guy, John, who managed that profile for a number of customers in Atlanta, you can either give that same type of profile directly to the customer. We see that often happening, for example, in the pharma, where you can give a customer access to a selective set of his or her products and just get feedback on that in an online way, meaning the customer connects and you see immediately the feedback and the commitment to the demand. Or, like Boone showed, you can collect that from different formats of input that are directly sent by the customer. That's a choice there. So online connection in a light version of the application, or upload from different media that can be collected as well. And in the same way, also through, for example, EDI and so, you can collect point of sales data, because in some industries, like in the consumer industries, in the tires and so, that is an important part as well. And with that, if you have open questions, please send them over to hugo@owenpartners.com, because our time is up here. I want to thank you for being very present today. It was a very popular webinar, and wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank Boone for the demo as well, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, and happy holidays.